Okay, thank you. I've been given the clear order to start the next session. And it is my pleasure to extend everyone here, our audience and speakers, our warm welcome from our base here in Suva, Fiji. I'm Shailendra Singh from the University of the South Pacific Media and Journalism Program. And I have much pleasure to introduce the speakers for session 2, of which the topic is legal, business, environment, politics, economics, migration in the context of indenture. And today we have an impressive lineup of 7 presentations, starting with Shailendra Mohammed, who's an independent researcher, Kumar Mahabir from the University of Guyana, Mohammed Alim from the University of Fiji, Praveen Kumar, Queensland, Australia, Jafreen Khan from the University of Fiji as well, Anupurna Devi Pandey from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and Ms. Jayakumar, University of Kerala, Sociology Department. Okay, just a quick revision of the ground rules before we start proper. Each speaker is allocated 15 minutes, and after 13 minutes, I will issue an alert. I will have to step in and stop the session once the 15 minutes is up. A reminder to our audience to please send your questions in the chat box, preferably with the name of the speakers to whom your question is directed. You can also ask questions directly by raising the virtual hand. And we will only take questions once all the speakers are done with their presentations. Okay, so without further ado, we will start the presentation with speaker number 1.
Welcome to the small presentation on right and wrong end, the kafala system. Most everybody, not some, many of you know what's kafala. Kafala is a particular system of labor administration that is existing in the Arab nations, including the GCC. It's a quite unbalanced system that it is oppressive against the workers and giving undue advantage to the employers and sponsors, usually. And it came from the Islamic jurisprudence and other matters. And with the exploration of oil, it got expanded, especially to regulate the high influx of the migrant labor to the oil-rich countries. And anyway, they have it to depend heavily on the migrant labor, but at the very same time, the system continues, especially in the GCC countries of the 6 countries and other countries. And similar systems are there in various parts of the world, but this is distinct in many ways. And it is to ensure the sustained supply of migrant workers. But the migrant workers, especially the migrant workers at the lower rung, they are highly dependent on the sponsor or the kafil during their period of employment. They cannot enter or exit the country without the explicit permission from the kafil or whatever the ground may be. And this presentation is based on some primary data as part of a project, and the secondary data heavily on given by the United Nations International Labour Organization and for other organizations. When to the key features of the kafala system, it's a highly restricted movement of communication and communication. They are severely restricted in their movement from within the from into the country and exit, entry and exit is highly, and even in some cases, even the communication is being restricted. And there is various kinds of bondages, including debt bondage, that is pushed on this migrant laborers. And the labor is many times appear to be forced labor. And closely related to this is the process of visa trading that gives rise to other issues. And irregular residency status, there is not any specific system of residency status that is highly dependent on the kafil, and the confiscation of passport. They are holding the passport of the immigrant labor, and there is low occupational mobility. They cannot change their occupation from one employer to another. The Saudi Arabia has the system in its extreme form, and every country that experiences this, they cannot join any trade unions. They cannot change their job or quit without the permission of the employer kafil. They cannot leave the country without their permission, and there is no minimum wages set for this. Domestic workers, especially, they are not covered under any labor laws. So they are the most vulnerable sections. There is no standard contract for the workers, usually, all the workers. And the case studies also shows some, I can read at least one, and the person from Kerala, he reached in Saudi Arabia in search of better paying jobs, and out of his debt here, and he was working in Saudi Arabia for the 15 years last I have, but after working here, he realized that the pay was not at par with the other similar jobs. I worked here for 3 years at the same company. As his visa expired, he requested his sponsor for the passport or visa renewal. Then he realized that his passport was missing. But in fact, it was confiscated, taken away by the employer kafir. And finally, he has to escape from there with the help of some people. So this kind of things, they are overly dependent on, and that usually amounts to some kind of modern age slavery, because the people, they cannot escape from but still this problem continue, because there is low national foreign population ratio, and the demand for migrant labor is very high, and the issue of public safety is also there. So they are retaining this irrespective of pressure from all these countries. Especially the issue currently came into address when the FIFA 2022 FIFA World Cup that is going to be held in Qatar. So that also necessitated a lot of people, immigrant people, working for the constructions and the stadiums and all these people. These violations also came into the light of the media, and there is a lot of protest against the system of the modern way of slavery, but still it is continuing, and the UN and other agencies are yet to come strongly against this, even though they are taking some steps. It's not enough, and some of the countries have stopped their people to sometimes to going into these countries to take up. And this is a very complex issue that cannot be taken addressed with any single piece of legislation. It necessitates a concerted effort from all the stakeholders, including the international organizations. With that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you, and it is extremely sorry for the inconvenience caused due to the technical snag and misunderstanding. Thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jen Madhavan. You are covering an area, modern day servitude that remains a huge problem. It shows that in some ways we haven't come very far from the Grimitia times. And I think there's not that much sort of attention to that problem in this part of the world. So thank you so much for bringing that to our attention.
Good afternoon. I hope people are able to hear me clearly.
Yeah, I can hear you and I can see your presentation on the screen.
Okay, so I can go ahead?
Yes. Yeah, okay. Let's go.
Thank you. Good afternoon all, and I wish all of you a happy Fiji Day, a day to mark our 51 years of independence. Last week, I was doing shopping alone. My wife sat in the car, fuming as I did not stop at the roadside for her to buy some orchids. I thought it was just a waste of money, especially when COVID-19 is creating havoc in my beautiful island. I entered the supermarket and was busy trying to choose a jar of olives from the many manufacturers' jars displayed on the shelves, when I overheard a child of 7 or 8 years old say to his mother, "Why can't we just buy? Tell Dad to send the money from Australia." I think he wanted a box of Cadbury chocolates, which was quite expensive. The mother retorted, "Yes, your father works in a farm, in the hot sun picking apples and grapes. We cannot be wasting money. We need to build a house. And remember, you want a room full of Spider-Man toys, don't you? When your father returns from Australia, he will bring lots of chocolates. First, we build our house and we build it strong. Remember what happened in the last hurricane." The child nodded his head and they moved to the next aisles. I could surmise from the child's expression that something devastating might have happened to their house for which the father had gone to Australia to work. Now, why do I tell you this story? It's to show how Pacific Seasonal Labor Scheme is benefiting some families in Fiji by raising their standard of living. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. My name is Mohammed Alim and I'm from the fertile and lush islands of Fiji. I did my postgrad diploma from the University of Fiji. Currently, I'm pursuing Masters in Arts, majoring in Literature and Language from the University of Fiji. I'll be deliberating on the theme Pacific Seasonal Labor Scheme. Approximately 25,000 seasonal workers from the Pacific are employed in Australia and New Zealand each year. The majority come from Tonga, Vanuatu, and Samoa, and participate in either Australia's Seasonal Worker Program, that is referred as SWP, or New Zealand's Recognized Seasonal Employer, RSE scheme. Tonga and Vanuatu and Samoa have also the largest number of workers as a proportion of their labor force. In Tonga's case, almost 15% of the workforce participated in the SWP or RSE last year. The numbers of Pacific seasonal workers in Australia or New Zealand at any given time vary, influenced by the harvest seasons for different products. As of May 2020, there are approximately 7,000 Pacific seasonal workers in Australia under the Seasonal Workers Program and 9,300 in New Zealand under the Recognized Seasonal Employer Scheme. Pacific Seasonal Labor Scheme is categorized as follows: Recognized Seasonal Employer, that is RSE program in New Zealand, and Seasonal Work Program, that is SWP in Australia. The aim of this paper is to discuss the characteristics of Pacific Seasonal Labor Scheme and to elaborate on the financial impacts on supplier nations. Introduction. The island economies in the Pacific have experienced fragile economic growth and limited structural change compared to the typical economy in the rest of developing Asia. Remoteness from major centers of population and economic activity and low economic density have contributed to these poor outcomes. To mitigate the impact of these constraints, bilateral arrangements with Australia and New Zealand over the last decade have given workers from these countries an opportunity to use seasonal labor migration to access higher paying, more dynamic, and diverse labor markets. These managed secular migration schemes are designed to benefit employers. In labor-intensive sectors, the workers from the Pacific that have limited opportunities for wage-earning employment in their own countries, and the communities that send the workers. The literature search for this paper included research, journal articles, policy papers, opinion pieces, media releases, and books that could be sourced electronically. It was limited to material that had been written since 2000 and to the geographic regions. To start with, keyword searches using Google Scholar were used. The keywords included seasonal migration, Pacific seasonal labor scheme, temporary migration, guest workers, labor mobility, and economic development. Once sourced, each piece of literature was then keyword searched for information related to each of the aspects to be covered in the paper. The limitation of the review is that no check was made to assess the reliability of the sources. Let's move on to the characteristics of Pacific Seasonal Labor Scheme. The scheme commenced on 1st July 2018. The scheme helps meet employer-worker demand in rural and regional Australia and New Zealand. It enables citizens of participating countries to take up low and semi-skilled work opportunities in rural and regional Australia for up to 3 years. The scheme focuses on sectors with projected employment growth in Australia and New Zealand. It is employer sponsored. It requires labor market testing to ensure Australians and New Zealanders have priority for local jobs and contains protections to safeguard against worker exploitation. The Pacific Seasonal Labor Scheme contributes to the economic development of participating Pacific Island countries and Timor-Leste by providing access to work opportunities in the Australian, New Zealand agriculture sector and accommodation sector in selected locations. The Pacific Seasonal Labor Scheme offers access to a reliable, returning workforce when there's not enough local Australian or New Zealanders labor to meet seasonal demand. The recently introduced seasonal migration scheme recognizes the need to let employers in the labor-intensive accommodation, agriculture, horticulture, and viticulture, that is wine, industries recruit workers. They recruit workers from the Pacific countries for several months per year, letting workers who comply with migration regulations return for future seasons. A balance between the needs of these industries for seasonal labor to help expand production and exports, and the need to provide employment opportunities for workers from the Pacific. Countries that are participating in the Pacific Seasonal Labor Scheme are Fiji, Kiribati, Nauru, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Timor-Leste, Tonga, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu. Let's move on to the financial impacts on supplier nations under the scheme. First is incomes. Income earning opportunities are one of the key wins of temporary labor mobility schemes, such as the Pacific Seasonal Labor Scheme. Income generation is the primary motivation for the participation in the scheme. Some Pacific Island country workers may only take home Australian $4,170 in combined remittances and savings. In Australia, gross earnings for a 6-month contract in 2016 averaged Australian $19,000 to $20,000 for Tongans and Vanuatu, and Australian $14,000 for other Pacific Island country workers. Second impact is remittances. There's no doubt that even as they vary between Pacific Island countries, earnings from the scheme employment are significant. This situation probably remains true even when opportunity costs relating to lost wages and or labor in home countries are accounted for. A high proportion of earnings go into remittances. Remittances are generally used to meet the household's immediate needs and often aid multiple relatives. In addition to cash remittances, seasonal workers often remit goods or return with them. And certainly some of these goods may improve short-term development outcomes. Chainsaws, for example, may make it easier to clear land and build houses. Thirdly, savings goals. Overall, seasonal workers appear to have similar aspirations for their savings, regardless of nationality, which mirror trends from wider Pacific remittance flows as well as seasonal worker schemes elsewhere. Education, consumption, welfare gains, that is improved housing, and small businesses are all common goals. At the same time, there has been some evidence of participation in seasonal work, leading to investment in small businesses, community development projects, and possibly in increased agricultural productivity. Such investments and projects appear to have been most successful when they were encouraged by community leaders or made a condition of participation in the scheme. Agricultural skills losses and food security, food security, sorry. It is evident that the loss of mainly male labor may well reduce agricultural production and thus challenge short-term food security, which may have financial impacts on the supplier nations. To add on, the COVID-19 crisis has imposed serious challenges on seasonal workers from Pacific Island countries. Border closures by both destination and origin countries aimed at slowing the pandemic have left thousands of seasonal workers stranded in Australia and New Zealand. Although early concerns related to the legality of their stay have been addressed by visa extensions and redeployment options, lack of work remains an issue in some areas given the seasonal nature of employment. Data from the World Bank Pound Survey on how COVID-19 has affected these workers suggests substantial and varying impacts on employment, earnings, and remittances. Domestic border closures and the dependence of workers on their employers to apply for visa extensions and redeployment in Australia and transportation to new places, that is in both Australia and New Zealand, present additional challenges to the continuation of their employment and expose them to risk of exploitation and distress. The workers' distinct living and working conditions, often in crowded spaces, together with their low levels of income, made them particularly vulnerable to infection and consequent economic hardships. In summation, for Pacific seasonal labor scheme workers and their families, the primary driver for participation in the scheme is an economic one. The scheme income is now factored into the lives of many households and contributes to their economic and social well-being. Savings are used to support daily living needs, pay for children's education, improve standards of housing, contribute to the church as well as family and community events, and invest in agriculture and other small businesses. In conclusion, new labor mobility programs between Pacific Island countries and Australia and New Zealand have been beneficial for host countries in a number of ways, which I have already discussed. Labor from the Pacific has not only assisted in filling shortages in labor-intensive industries such as horticulture, but it has also increased productivity levels compared with what was possible with traditional sources of seasonal labor. Specific studies in the Pacific have shown positive development outcomes for households supplying workers, their communities, and their home countries. Thank you. These are my references. And thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you, Mohammed Alim. Some really solid research there. Congratulations.
Thank you,
and
sir.
The Pacific Labor Seasonal Scheme has been welcomed in the region. And as you point out, it has many benefits, but it has to be monitored because there are problems, but these are problems that can be addressed. So there was a really good presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.